everyone. This is Scissors Beats Paper. I'm Nicole.
And I'm Logan.
And today we're going to be talking about the second half of our Cold War podcast. For those of you that don't know, part 1 is currently up on YouTube, and if you found this video, it probably should show up part 1 first. However, in that one we talked about the American-Russian dynamic during World War II. We talked about the U.S. policy of containment, the atomic age, and the Red Scare. So if you're looking for any of those topics, that's in podcast number 1, not in this one. This time we're going to be talking about the space race, proxy wars, which will include the Cuban Missile Crisis, even though it wasn't really a war, and the everlasting effects of the Cold War, specifically on American society and politics, as well as its parallels between the Cold War and our current war on terror. We're going to go ahead and start with the space race. And the space race itself was a competition between the United States and the USSR to explore space using artificial satellites and eventually manned spacecraft. As with most things during the Cold War, space exploration served as another dramatic arena for competition between the Americans and the Soviets.
All right, so Sputnik was the first kind of shot in that space race war, or whatever you want to call it. October 4th, 1957. It was a satellite launched into orbit, the first man-made object to ever be put into Earth's orbit or launched into Earth's orbit. I'm not sure the technical scientific way to describe that.
Because this is history and we're not science people.
Yeah. So basically that caused a lot of, I guess, paranoia because of the atomic age and the possibilities that could provide for loading that with a nuclear warhead or things like that.
By the way, fun fact, Sputnik is the Russian word for traveler, in case anyone cared to know. I thought that was a fun fact. I didn't know what Sputnik meant. I was just like, man, that's a cool word.
Yeah, I didn't know that either.
Well, now you know. Anyways, Sputnik's launch, like Logan said, came as a surprise and not really a pleasant one to most Americans. There was definitely a level of astonishment, and there was certainly a measure of fear, because we weren't really sure what Sputnik was capable of doing. Was it going to drop bombs on us or take little pictures? I mean, it really frightened the Americans.
I just remembered watching an episode of Boy Meets World where they have like a flashback of like Sputnik being launched, and they're all like crazy terrified. I don't know if you remember that.
I don't remember that episode.
That's an old show, but it's funny.
When I think of Sputnik, I automatically am like, October Sky. Because, by the way, if you have not seen October Sky, I really recommend it. It's got...
Jake Gyllenhaal.
Thank you. That's his name. I was going to be like the guy that played in the Gay movie. It's got Jake Gyllenhaal in it. It's fantastic. It's about space exploration and Sputnik. And anyways. Oh, I apologize. I'm sleepy, so it's going to be quirky tonight. In the United States, space was seen as the next frontier, a logical extension of the grand American tradition of exploration, and it was crucial not to lose too much ground to the Soviets. So, in 1958, the U.S. launched its own satellite named the Explorer-1, which was designed by the U.S. Army under the direction of rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. Again, if you want to know about that, watch October Sky. He's in it. I mean, not like actual Wernher von Braun, but
he's the inspiration for the character.
Yeah, the main character, Jake Gyllenhaal's character, that's like his idol.
Yeah, not based off his life, but
right.
Like, that's who he aspires to be or meet or
exactly
work with or whatever.
That same year, President Eisenhower signed a public order creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. NASA, as we call it today. NASA was a federal agency dedicated to space exploration, as well as several programs seeking to exploit the military potential of space. Because at the end of the day, the Cold War is all about military potential.
Yeah, and there were additional satellites that were created and used basically for the sole purpose of collecting info on Soviets and their allies. So basically kind of the first, I don't know how you describe it, the
like spy planes?
Technological achievements in being able to spy with that kind of technology, basically.
Not James Bond spy, but like enemy of the state spy. Project Mercury was NASA's first manned spaceflight program undertaken in 1958. In 6 manned space missions, each piloted by a single astronaut, the Mercury program established that man could not only live, but could also function in space as a pilot, an engineer, and experimenter. Despite the efforts of the United States' NASA program, the Soviets were one step ahead, launching the first man into space in April of 1961. His name was Yuri Gagarin, and
Yuri Gagarin.
Gagarin. See, I apologize. I don't speak Russian, and I will most likely butcher most of the Russian names in here.
It's good bar trivia.
It is good bar. We gotta go to Pluckers soon and use that. Anyways, Yuri Gagarin. What was it?
Gagarin.
Yuri Gagarin was the first man in space, and he finished his first orbit of Earth on April 12th of 1961.
And not far behind, in May 1961, Alan Shepard was the first American man in space.
And shortly after that, President John F. Kennedy released his official statement saying, and I quote, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. Sadly, Kennedy won't be around to see this dream through."
Just an extra bullet point in the timeline is that in February 1962, John Glenn was the first American to orbit Earth, and that's also the same year that Project Apollo began. That's kind of the keyword that most Americans know is Apollo.
Which is where I was going to go next with that. 8 years later, the United States will launch the Apollo 11 into space on a mission to the moon. And on July 20th of 1969, 2 American astronauts will take the first steps and the first walk on the moon. Their names were Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. This event was broadcast on live TV to a worldwide audience. Thousands tuned in to hear Neil Armstrong's now famous phrase, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
The U.S. actually was the first to land on the moon and basically win the space race. Kind of desire to continue waned a little bit as far as manned missions. NASA still obviously exists today.
No, it doesn't. NASA's closed down. We don't have NASA anymore.
Stupid. Have you seen The Martian? It's very real.
I'm just telling you, NASA lost all its funding.
Anyways, Dick. Astronauts basically became superheroes, and they had ticker tape parades.
Yeah,
and stuff like that.
Every little kid wanted to grow up and be an astronaut. They were literally national heroes because not only did the Apollo 11 end the space race, but it fulfilled a national goal that was proposed by Kennedy 8 years earlier in 1961.
Yeah, and culturally speaking, it kind of influenced a lot of pop culture of the time, like Star Trek, like a lot of sci-fi writers and things like that, and then eventually Star Wars a little bit later on.
About 10 years later, but yeah. Oh man, that would have been a great time to live in, where space was the most wicked frontier you could go into.
The most wicked.
The most wicked. I think we should explore the ocean and make a little bubble pod down there. And that's if there's a nuclear war, we can go there.
We can live under the sea.
Yeah, instead of in space. It sounds way better in the ocean.
Or Jar Jar Binks.
Yes.
Exactly.
Hey, we're all trying to enjoy The Force Awakens. Let's not bring up episode 1, okay?
Shut up.
Okay, so let's talk proxy wars of the Cold War. We're going to talk about Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Cuban Revolution, which wasn't really a proxy war, but is still a power struggle between the US and the USSR that turned into a legitimate crisis and could have plausibly led us to World War III. And before we jump into the Korean War, I want to warn you guys that we aren't going to be talking about the military history of these wars. We're really going to be discussing the role these wars play in the larger conflict of the Cold War. So Logan and I were actually talking about it yesterday, that if we wanted to do something over Vietnam, it could be an entire podcast by itself.
If not more.
Yeah, if not more. It could probably be 2 or 3 podcasts, depending on how we wanted to do it. So we're not going to go in a lot of detail about the military stuff. We'll talk about how it led up to the conflict and then how that conflict played out in the grander scheme of things. The Allies had declared in December of 1943 that Korea was to become a free and independent state, but it needed protection from the Japanese. So it was agreed by the Soviet Union and the rest of the great powers that the United States would occupy the southern portion of Korea and the Soviet Union would occupy the northern portion of Korea. However, at the end of World War II, both the US and the Soviet Union had troops still in Korea, and neither army seemed willing to leave the Korean peninsula. Instead, they temporarily, air quotes, divided the nation along the 38th parallel. Now, it's worth mentioning that North Korea was more industrialized of the two areas. They also had a plethora of coal. So these two things combined, industry and coal, are two things that the Russians are going to be really interested in. At a conference in Moscow in December of 1945, the foreign ministers of the Soviet Union and Britain and the U.S. Secretary of State met and discussed a 5-year trusteeship for Korea. Obviously, all across Korea, people were enraged and demonstrated against any type of foreign intrusion. And rightfully so. I mean, if you think about it, it would be like Great Britain and France coming to America and making decisions about America for us.
They basically said, suck it, we're going to annex you.
Right. Which...
We're going to exploit you for your industry and to use you as a puppet.
Yeah, exactly. Which is pretty much what all the great powers always do.
Yeah, it happens.
Carve up China. There's no long-term effects. Carve up Africa. Who cares about them? I mean, it's okay for us because we're the power. We're the person with the biggest stick. But, the people who don't have the stick, it sucks to be them. Eventually, negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union break down. And the U.S. was more directly involved in the South Korean government, while the Soviets allowed more freedom to the government that they had established in North Korea. And what I mean is, the United States was much more hand-on. We basically told South Korea, this is how you're going to do it because we know how to run a capitalist democracy. And the Soviets, while they played a hand, they were really only interested in the industry and the coal that North Korea had. They weren't interested in legitimately establishing communism. Once the Japanese left, the Soviets came in and took a bunch of the machines and stuff that were left behind. Not saying that the Soviets are the big bad guy, but I'm just saying I think Americans in general, their goal initially was to establish democracies, which falls into the domino theory, which is if, one section becomes a democracy or one section of the world, falls to communism, that eventually everything else will. And that's almost validated in the fact that the Soviets were communist and China fell to communism shortly after that, shortly after World War II.
Yeah, let's not forget that the U.S. was basically occupying Japan for a while there.
After World War II, the United States was occupying Japan. We essentially told Japan, you can no longer have a military or say in things. Here's your democracy. You're going to love it, and we're going to be your protector.
They said, suck it.
No, they didn't. They couldn't say suck it.
No, I'm saying we said suck it to them. You can't.
We did in the form of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The U.S. was training and supplying South Korea's military at the time, but they were also worried that South Korea would attempt to invade the North. So,
Plot twist,
we didn't give South Korea everything that it needed because we were legitimately worried that they were going to invade North Korea to try and unify Korea. To prevent this, the United States kept all of South Korea's military capacity limited. And we also provided them with just enough military strength to combat the guerrillas that were fighting against the government that we had established. By 1949, both the Soviet Union and the United States decided to pull its troops out of Korea to give the Koreans more independence. The North Korean leader, his name was Kim Il-sung. Again, I apologize if I'm not saying the names right.
I think it sounds right.
I'm a British historian, so if it's not English, I can't say it. Kim Il-sung, the North Korean leader, met with Stalin in Moscow shortly after 1949 when the Soviet Union and the United States had pulled out their troops. He requested that Stalin aid him in unifying Korea by force. Now, initially Stalin refuses, and he strongly advises Kim Il-sung against any invasion. Stalin definitely believed that if the 38th parallel didn't remain peaceful, that it would provoke the West into war. And honestly, we should probably give Stalin a little bit of credit here. He didn't want the Cold War to turn hot. Now, enter the game changer. China successfully established itself as a communist nation. Now, this bleeds back into the domino theory, like we were talking about earlier. Stalin, who was impressed by the victory of the communists in China, sends a telegram to Kim Il-sung stating that he will now be willing to help him unify Korea. And for the record, Stalin didn't do this out of the kindness of his heart or to spread communism. He primarily did this for resources. Remember when I mentioned that North Korea was more industrialized and had copious amounts of coal? Well, Stalin wanted 25,000 tons of lead. Kim Il-sung proceeds to invade the South. And news of the invasion in the U.S. created excitement and dismay. And Truman was not about to respond with anything less than a show of power and strength. Now, here's the odd thing about the Korean War is the newspapers in the United States actually knew about the invasion of North Korea into South Korea before Truman and his cabinet even did.
I didn't know that.
There was no chance for appeasement this time. The United States was being supported by the United Nations. War became inevitable. Korea is often referred to as the Forgotten War, and according to historian Melinda Pash, it's because, quote, when the war first broke out, people worried that American involvement would usher in the same type of rationing and full mobilization that had characterized the Second World War. That failed to occur, and within a few months, most Americans turned back to their own lives, ignoring the conflict raging half a world away. End quote. And to an extent, I believe she's right. And even today, we forget about the Korean War. It's like the war that's sandwiched in between World War II and Vietnam. In schools, most students learn that it occurred, but not why or how it affected the larger conflict that is the Cold War. And honestly, prior to doing research for this podcast, my perception of the Korean War was the TV show MASH, which is great.
It's true.
But the question I'd like to answer is why didn't we use atomic bombs to settle this dispute? At the end of 1950, the USSR had about 5 atomic bombs, and the United States had 369 operational atomic bombs. With that 74-1 advantage, why didn't the United States not use its nuclear supremacy to reverse the worst military setback it had suffered in nearly 100 years? And there's a few different reasons as to why the United States didn't use atomic weapons. One of these is that there was the problem of what target. You know, when we dropped the bombs in Japan, we chose 2 very populated cities. And the atomic weapons that we had created, they were supposed to be used against cities, industrial complexes, military bases, and transport networks. But few of these things existed on the Korean Peninsula. Since the Chinese and the Soviets were funding the aggression against the South, the United States would have targeted Chinese cities or Soviet industrial complexes. However, we didn't want to because the political ramifications would have been even more severe. Like Stalin, the United States didn't want the Cold War to become a hot one, so bombing the Chinese and the Soviets was absolutely out of the question. Another reason was that in 1951, Chinese forces had outrun their supply lines, and the UN forces had decided to take the offensive. My perspective as a military historian is that atomic weapons are primarily defensive tools. So if we're taking the offensive, there isn't any purpose in using them. And we did, believe it or not, use them as a defensive tool even in World War II. It had been estimated that more than 1 million American lives would have been lost if we had attempted an amphibious assault on the main Japanese mainland. And so we decided to use the atomic weapons that we had created instead. It was more of a defensive maneuver than it was an offensive one. So when the UN forces decided to take the offensive, we ruled out atomic warfare. Until recently, it was believed that there was no direct Soviet-American military confrontation during the Korean War. However, we do know now, because documents have come to light in recent years, that there was indeed an air battle fought between Soviet and American pilots over the Korean Peninsula, as well as a small shooting war that happened between the 2 superpowers. Now, the shooting conflict was actually covered up not only by the Americans, but also by the Soviets because they didn't want it to escalate and get out. And then the air battle was just never publicized.
Anyways, if you're still awake after that lecture, as far as casualties, 5 million Koreans died. About half of that total was civilians. So I didn't actually put this note in in my notes, but it was something about the ratio is even greater than, Russia during World War II and Germans during World War II and all that because of the population. Obviously, not as big as those other countries
Right.
of civilian casualties. And then 40,000 Americans were killed and 100,000 more were wounded. And also, a fun little fact that there are still ramifications today because there's the demilitarized zone still exists.
Yeah, the war was never ended. We
It's-
signed an armistice.
It's still
It's
ongoing.
still technically, well, I don't know, because technically war is defined by Congress declaring war.
Okay.
And so technically Korea wasn't a war, but
Don't be a historian snob.
no, I'm just saying that, yes, technically we signed an armistice and that's why it's still going on today, but if we're armistice.
There you go.
Technically we signed an armistice. God damn it. Armistice. I can't say it. Armistice.
Armadillocyst. You're dumb.
I know.
It's not technically a proxy war, but it is a small piece of the narrative of communist revolutions, which kind of tie into this. The Cuban Revolution from 1953 to 1959, with ultimately ending with Fidel Castro taking over from Batista is his name, who was backed by the U.S. He was kind of thought of as a puppet, but basically that kind of spread a lot of fear because of the communist country right in America's backyard.
Literally 90 miles from the United States coastline. Cuba is 90 miles from Florida. It was it put a lot of pressure on the United States.
Yeah, and they basically nationalized everything in the country, so business interests were kind of decimated. And that made America not happy because we like money and stuff. So.
Well, and one thing about Americans and Cubans, our relationship with them goes back to the late 1800s. Even our founding fathers like Jefferson and Adams had pushed for America to make Cuba a state. I can't remember if it was based on resources or that it was so close to the United States, but America's always had a thumb in the pie. And now it belonged to Spain, and this is a little off topic, but Cuba had belonged to Spain, and then when Spain entered financial difficulty in the late 1800s, America had a deal. The United States had said, okay, Spain, you can't give Cuba to anybody else, and if you do give it to anybody else, then we take it. But we had never anticipated the Cubans gaining their own independent nation, and so in the late 1800s, when they gained freedom from Spain, America was in quite a predicament. It was like, America stands for freedom, and we were like, do we back the revolutionaries? Or do we value our own interest because it's in our interest to take Cuba? But, American-Cuban relations go back several years prior to this. So when it fell to communism, it was quite a blow to the United States, not just because of the Truman Doctrine and the domino theory, but just because we actually had a relationship with Cuba at the time, and we had that relationship for nearly 70 years at that point.
Right after communism took over Cuba, Castro took over Cuba, Eisenhower basically economically isolated them from the world, with the exception of the Soviets, obviously, who wanted to help their Cuban cousins with a embargo. So basically no trade, no anything. So they really only could trade with other communist countries.
And that embargo was just lifted. Was it last year or 2014?
I don't know when it was lifted. I know travel restrictions are being lifted or have been within the last year. I'm not sure when the
Anyways, it's during Obama's administration. It was a big deal. It's a big deal. We ended the embargo.
Damn liberals.
Those Democrats, and they're giving the people rights. What's wrong with them? Socialized healthcare. Get out of here, you communists. Once the United States discovered Soviet missiles in Cuba, Kennedy's military advisors said that it was a perfect excuse to invade Cuba. And like I said, because the United States had always had an interest in Cuba, that probably was really appealing. However, Kennedy was worried that if the United States took that aggressive of an action and invaded Cuba, that it would provoke the Soviets into attacking the United States directly, and that could possibly lead to nuclear war. And standing here in the 21st century, sitting in my office, we're not too scared of nuclear war. Now the big threat is terrorism, but how fucking horrifying is the idea of like terrorists armed with nuclear war? But I mean, like back then it was nations, and nuclear war was a serious threat.
We didn't talk about the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Oh
in
no,
1961. So there were a lot of expatriate Cubans that the CIA basically wanted to fund and train to try and kind of reverse Castro so they could take it back, and it failed epically. And so Cuba kind of laughed at us. It's like, that was funny.
You're cute, America.
Yeah.
Sometimes we do stuff and I'm just like, oh my god.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. We let the Vietnamese whoop our ass. And we were the strongest. We were a superpower and they were a tiny little country. They whooped it. It's embarrassing. I'm so glad we didn't live back then. Oh wait, we live in the current Vietnam era with the war on terror. So Kennedy decided to try something other than an all-out war, especially after the Bay of Pigs and Cuba giggling at us. So he enacted a strict naval blockade around Cuba to halt any further Soviet shipments, specifically of ballistic missiles that were capable of delivering nuclear weaponry. The Soviet leader, and I'm apologizing in advance,
Nikita Khrushchev.
Bam. Nikita Khrushchev.
Fascinating character. You should read about him.
Khrushchev. That's a sweet first name, Nikita. I'm gonna name my kid Russian stuff because it just sounds way better than American stuff. Anyways, Khrushchev, what was his name?
Khrushchev.
Yes, said that the blockade would be ignored. And at this point, everyone was seriously concerned that we would be led into war. And after receiving this message from the Soviet leader on October 23rd, our defense, the United States' defense, went up to DEFCON 2. And that's the highest it's ever been in all of history. And by the way, what I mean by DEFCON is the defense readiness condition of the nation or the world or etc. And it goes on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 being no threat and 1 being the ultimate nuclear war. The missiles are in the air. And
obviously you would know this if you've seen War Games, but whatever.
Yes, but
with Matthew Broderick.
I'm going to go for broke and say that not everyone's probably seen that.
Oh, they're dumb.
DEFCON 2. Anyways, DEFCON 2, it was the highest it had ever been in all of history. Now, that wasn't a worldwide defensive thing. That was strictly for the United States.
You thought that was like a global thing?
I did. Well, nuclear warfare affects everyone, so why wouldn't the whole world be on DEFCON 2?
Defense readiness, though.
Oh, that makes sense. Oh my god. What does the rest of the world use? Never mind.
Nobody cares about them because we're Americans.
Because we're Americans. We don't care what the rest of the world does. Spoiler alert, we're still here, so there wasn't a nuclear apocalypse. Or at least there hasn't been one yet. Apocalypse? What did I say? I'm sorry. It's like 11 o'clock and I've been up since 6. I'm exhausted, so forgive my fat tongue. Don't go there. Don't say it. So despite the enormous tension, the Soviet and the American leaders found a way out of the deadlock. During the crisis, the Americans and the Soviets had exchanged letters and other communications, and on October 26, the Soviet leader sent a message to Kennedy in which he offered to remove the Cuban missiles in exchange for a promise that the United States would not invade Cuba and that the United States would remove its missiles from Turkey.
That was a secret agreement.
Yes, well, I'm about to... right here, it's the next thing. The Kennedy administration openly agreed not to invade Cuba, but secretly agreed to remove the United States' missiles from Turkey, which we didn't talk about, but we talked about it kind of in the last podcast that we had put missiles in Turkey, which was... I Googled it earlier, and it's like 1,500 kilometers from Russia.
It's right there.
Unfortunately, I live in the United States, and we don't use kilometers, so I have no idea how many miles that is. But apparently it's really close. I looked on it on a map and it's super close. It would be like them having Cuba and Florida being 90 miles. Mm. The Vietnam War was very similar to the Korean War. Both have roots in the Truman Doctrine and the domino theory. Both countries were split into communist North and democratic South. For the United States, the Vietnam War was long and costly, and it pitted us against the communist regime of the northern Vietnamese. After the Korean War, the Cold War intensified. And there were already issues in Vietnam prior to the United States intervention anyway. France had been there for years fighting the Vietnamese people.
Yeah, France, they got beaten too. We didn't learn from their mistakes. But that's another topic.
If there's one thing I can say about the Vietnamese is that that's one resilient populace.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, before France was there, the Japanese were there, right?
I don't know about that.
Anyways,
I'm assuming that they have been a target for subjugation for
maybe it was the Chinese.
As long as they existed, probably.
Yeah, oh, for sure. I mean, they're one resilient people. They fought war after war after war to gain their independence. So once France gets whooped and leaves, because they're France, let's be real, the United States enters. But our intervention doesn't start until 1955, when President Eisenhower pledged his support to South Vietnam. But this support was primarily just aiding the South Vietnamese in their goals. President Kennedy, once he's elected, will increase U.S. aid, but he won't commit to a large-scale military intervention. Large-scale intervention won't come until the Gulf of Tonkin incident, when the U.S. destroyer Maddox exchanged some shots with North Vietnamese torpedo boats.
Allegedly.
Well, no, this one actually happened. Now, a couple of days later, supposedly the same battleship got into a skirmish with more Vietnamese torpedo ships, and that one is the one that is fake.
There's intrigue surrounding it.
Right. More than 3 million people, including 58,000 Americans, were killed in the Vietnam War, and more than half of those were Vietnamese civilians. Starting to see a parallel? Because that was the same thing in Korea. Most of the casualties were civilian casualties, which I find interesting, because it's kind of after World War II that happens.
Military technology increases, or expands and becomes greater in terms of ability to destroy everything.
That could be it. I also think that it has to do with the fact that we didn't understand that we could fight wars with limited aims. We were still in total war mode, and it was like, destroy the populace and you'll destroy the war-making machine, which was completely unnecessary for the Korean and the Vietnam War. It could have been a war of limited aims, but they weren't.
Such a backwards country like Vietnam. I'm just saying, they weren't a developed nation. They didn't have...
Neither was Korea. I mean, yeah, they didn't even have roads. Not backwards in like a terrible sense, but underdeveloped. Underdeveloped.
Third world.
You're right.
Third world problems.
Which makes it even more humiliating that we lost both of those wars. I don't know. Korea, we kind of won, we kind of lost. It was just an armistice.
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 Armistice? You're saying arm assist.
I am. Okay. In 1969, at the peak of U.S. involvement in the war, more than 500,000 U.S. military personnel were involved in the Vietnam conflict. There was a growing opposition to the war in the United States that led to a very bitter division among Americans. And realistically, this country nearly fell during that era. You have the civil rights movement, you have the women's movement, and then all of a sudden you have Vietnam, you throw all of that in the mix, and this country nearly fell in the 60s, 70s-ish. Oh man, Watergate. No, that's later. Right? It's in the 70s, isn't it?
Early 70s.
Okay. I couldn't remember when Watergate was. Because I don't care.
2005.
Yep. Okay. And in 1975, communist forces seized control of Saigon, ending the Vietnam War, and the country was unified as a Socialist Republic of Vietnam the following year. I find it interesting that all the communist nations put republic in their name.
People's Republic
of China.
Mm-hmm. Stuff like that. Democratic, I think North Korea is the Democratic Republic of North Korea, right?
Yeah. What is that about?
Maybe that's just the translation for...
I'm going to Google Republic real quick. I find it interesting that most communist countries have republic in their name. A republic is a sovereign state or country which is organized with a form of government in which power resides in elected individuals representing the citizen body. Yeah, no.
So not Korea or China.
So not Korea or China or Vietnam. I knew if you put republic in the name, it doesn't make you a republic. My God. Okay.
It's just the PR.
That's true. It makes it look less scary. I guess you can't name it the Socialist Communist Government of Vietnam. On to the Afghan-Soviet conflict. The Soviet version of Vietnam lasted over 9 years, from December of 1979 to February of 1989, and is referred to as the Soviet-Afghan War. In short, left-wing military officers who had forged close ties with the Soviet Union overthrew Afghanistan's government. What ensued was a ruthless purge of any domestic opposition, as well as an extensive land and social reform, which was completely resented by the devout Muslims that live there and the anti-communist population.
Yeah, newsflash. Middle East doesn't like when you try and tell them what to do.
No way!
But we don't know that yet. We're not there yet in the story.
We haven't learned. Well, we haven't learned today. You know, I give Hitler a hard time for invading Russia after having Napoleon as a primary example for not invading Russia. Well, guess what? We had a primary example of what not to do in Afghanistan with the Soviet Union. Then what do? Go to Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
Several insurgencies rose up in opposition of this new government, most of which were tribal and urban Islamic groups. And these uprisings, along with internal fighting and coups within the government, prompted the Soviets to invade the country. The Afghan war quickly settled down into a stalemate, with more than 100,000 Soviet troops controlling the cities, larger towns, and major garrisons, while the insurgents moved with relative freedom throughout the countryside. Soviet troops tried to crush the insurgency by various tactics, but the guerrillas generally eluded their attacks. The insurgents were also supplied with shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles supplied to them by 3 guesses who. If you guessed the United States, you guessed correctly. And for those Call of Duty players out there, a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft device is like an RPG. Or for this area, it was called the Stinger, which I think made a debut in Black Ops. I think Black Ops 1 had the Stinger in it.
I don't recognize any Call of Duty game that's not Black Ops.
That's me neither.
The original Black Ops, because they're all garbage otherwise.
Because Blops is amazing. Everything else can eat a dick.
Microsoft hurry up and put it on backwards compatibility.
Oh man, that'd be awesome. Get the crew together again.
Oh yeah.
We dominated. I had a quad in Blops 1. It was awesome with an RC car. It blew everybody up. It was dope.
Stupid. I forgot about those. I haven't played the game so
See?
long.
That's so great. Okay. The war in Afghanistan became a quagmire for what, by the late 1980s, was a disintegrated Soviet Union. The Soviets suffered some 15,000 dead and even more injured, and finally withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989. After the Soviet-Afghan War, a new world order essentially emerges. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the phrase New World Order was meant to define the nature of the post-Cold War era and the spirit of cooperation that many had hoped to achieve. However, historians will look back and say that this was no ordinary time, but a truly defining moment, an unprecedented period of global change. Once the Berlin Wall came down in November of 1989, the Soviet Union began to break up into several separate nations, I think 12 to be exact. Different challenges then started to present themselves. Suddenly, there's the threat of nuclear terrorism, which sitting in a post-9/11 world sounds fucking horrifying. See, Saddam Hussein and other regional power brokers challenged the newly found peace with a surprise attack on the small nation of Kuwait in 1991. President Bush Sr. organized a coalition of allies and Middle Eastern powers that successfully pushed the invading Iraqi forces back, but we stopped short of invading Iraq and capturing Hussein. Now, I'm not saying this is foreshadowing, but no wait, yeah, that's pretty much exactly what I'm saying. Over the next 12 years, Hussein is going to have free reign and cause a lot of conflict in the Middle East. And many scholars claim that this lack of new strategic vision for U.S. foreign policy after the Cold War resulted in many missed opportunities. Hussein being one of those missed opportunities, especially considering we're dealing with his shit a decade later. The post-Cold War world was widely considered to be unipolar, with the United States being the sole remaining superpower of the world. The Cold War defined the political role of the United States in the post-World War II world. And by 1989, the U.S. held military alliances with more than 50 countries, had 526,000 troops posted abroad in dozens of countries, and 326,000 in Europe, 2/3 of which were in West Germany, and about 130,000 were in Asia. The Cold War marked an apex of peacetime military-industrial complexes, especially in the United States, and large-scale military funding for science, example the space race. For a time, it seemed that American dominance was enough because the most important traditional security concern of the past, the prevention of another war that included great powers, had finally dissipated. And U.S. policy seemed to be guiding important regional disputes, such as those in the Middle East and on the Korean Peninsula, towards some sort of settlement. But in the absence of a defining idea for American policy, this transitional period became a time of one step forward and one step back. For example, the U.S. made significant progress on the international economic front, with the launch of the North American Free Trade Agreement and the World Trade Organization, only to confront the expiration of fast-track authority, financial meltdown in many parts of the world, and the debacle of the 1999 World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle. And democracy spread like never before, yet in many places its roots remained shallow and vulnerable to disappointment and backlash. Then, in the 1990s, the wars of Yugoslav succession and the dilemma posed by failed states, such as Somalia and Haiti, moved the issue of humanitarian intervention to the top of the United States' foreign policy agenda. The U.S. saw relative successes like Kosovo, and then complete failures like Rwanda. There was a confusion over both the goals and the means of U.S. foreign policy. From the American perspective, foreign engagement appeared to be a matter of choice, not necessity. With the demise of the Soviet Union, the oceans once again seemed to afford us privileged security. Even in the face of a growing international threat from the production of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, infectious diseases, and environmental degradation, we continued to feel secure right here in our homeland. Then came the tragic events of 9/11, which helped end the decade of complacency. 9/11 essentially forced Americans to clearly see that foreign policy still matters, and that our oceans and our ICBMs alone do not make us safe. 9/11 brought home the stark reality that if we do not engage with the world will likely engage with us, and often in ways we don't like. So on September 11th of 2001, the innocence that Americans had enjoyed ended, and we entered a post-Cold War world, a period when increasingly potent international challenges intersect with the still important traditional concerns. The attacks were a grim reminder of how the march of globalization has raised the stakes for international threats. The terrorists used cell phones and email and the internet to communicate. They moved money via wire, and they turned civilian airlines into flying missiles that killed 3,000 unexpected people right here on the American homeland. International threats can present a clear and present danger in our way of life. They require a resolute response. And at the same time, we don't have the luxury of focusing exclusively on international threats.
America.
Yeah, America. All of these things essentially stem from the Cold War. We had finally achieved what we had been hoping to do. We stopped the Soviets from spreading communism, and the threat of a superpower war was no longer with us. All of a sudden, Americans felt, well, foreign policy is an optional thing for us to have because we were suddenly safe again. And right in the moment that we thought we were safe, that's when we were hit the hardest. And so it's important to remember that the Cold War not only influenced our foreign policy for 2 to 3 decades after its actual end. Well, we're not 3 decades away. We are. Gross. Why am I so old?
We're old, yeah.
Yeah, wow. not only does it influence foreign policy 2 to 3 decades later, but the War on Terror is incredibly similar to the Cold War. Now, the War on Terror is technically a hot war, but at the same time, if you think about it, anytime you have a war that is being waged on a noun, it never goes well. The war on drugs, the war on terror. How do you wage war on a noun? Anyways, I'm not getting into that because that's not what this podcast is about. But you need to understand that there are a lot of similarities. The panic, the Red Scare, things like that, they're all things that we saw again post 9/11. And so the Cold War is significant in American history because essentially why we teach history, why you're supposed to learn history, why it's required for every college student in the face of America to take it, is so that way you can understand that you can be a better generation than we were. You know, I mean, I can proudly say that at least after 9/11, we didn't ship all of the Muslims to internment camps. However, we did discriminate against them openly, and nobody was ever brought to justice for that. So maybe if something terrible happens in the next 40, 50 years, God forbid, maybe the next generation, because they can learn from our mistakes, maybe they'll be a little more tolerant. Or maybe they'll be even worse. We don't know.
Are you saying that we'll be more tolerant whenever Trump takes over America for the next 40 years?
I'm scared. The next 40 years, Trump's going to ignore the 8-year policy and be like, I'm a dictator now.
Yeah, the 2-term limit.
The 2-term limit, which was established after FDR.
Obviously.
Well, FDR was a compassionate dictator, let's be real.
He was a cripple.
He went polio. Anyways, okay, guys, that's going to be it for the podcast. However, it's time for you to select a new topic. And we have 3 topics ready for you. Remember that you do have to vote on it. You can vote on our Twitter, which the link will be below. You can vote on our Tumblr, which the link will be below. And you can vote right here on YouTube in the comment section. The first thing that we're going to offer to you guys is the topic of the rise of the Third Reich. We'll kind of discuss Hitler's coming to power. We'll discuss kind of how he pulled Germany out of the depression that they were in. And we'll kind of talk about how badass it was that he took basically all of Western Europe within a year, because I'm fascinated with that. What a boss. The second topic that we're going to give you guys is going to be the Bolshevik Revolution. And so we're going to talk about, well, go ahead, you say.
The Russian history leading up to that, which is really fascinating. Catherine the Great, I believe. Lots of fascinating things with the
we'll be talking
monarchy
about,
and all that.
Yeah, we'll be talking about probably the first 20, 30 years leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution. And then we'll talk about how the Bolshevik Revolution, took hold
and then
of
we can
Russia.
talk about Stalin, too.
Well, of course.
Because that guy's cray-cray.
He really was. Well, and we'll have to talk about Lenin.
He makes Hitler kind of look mild.
You think? Right before World War II happens, like literally, okay, the non-aggression pact between Stalin and Germany was like, oh, we have this awesome non-aggression pact, and then like right before Hitler invades Russia, Stalin killed all of his like military advisors because he thought that they were trying to plot a coup against him. He just killed them all. So like going into World War II, we had like no military leaders.
Dumb.
Guy was crazy, man. Okay, so first topic, rise of the Third Reich. Second topic, the Bolshevik Revolution. And the third topic is going to be entirely up to you guys. If there is something that you want us to go over and enough of you vote on it, we will 110% take that into consideration. Whoever has the most votes is going to be the topic that we select next.
By enough, we mean like 2 votes.
Well, I mean, hopefully more of you are listening than that.
I'm just saying. This is a democracy, okay?
This is a dictatorship. No, this is a democracy. This is the podcast where you, the audience, picks our topic and we research the shit out of it and then deliver the awesomeness that is Scissors Beats Paper. So, if you have an original topic that you would love to listen to us talk about, then send it our way. Anything else? Okay, guys, that's going to be it. This is Nicole.
And I'm Logan.
And this is Scissors Beats Paper, a history podcast.